ideal is to instead ask, where are you from? Or like, assume that you're different, is to ask, where are you going? And I think that is a little bit of a uniting question. It's a forward-looking question. It's an opportunity question. It's about, what is your vision? Where are you from? And like, what could we do together? That's a much more like open-ended, lightning question.
Welcome to Latinx in Power, a podcast that will share stories of amazing Latinx leaders. Hosted by Thaisa Fernandez, a proud Latina in tech, program, and product manager living in Silicon Valley and sharing her experiences.
Welcome to Latinx in Power. I'm so honored to have Valerie Villarreal with us today.
Hi, good to be here. Nice to see you, Thaisa.
Valerie is a product manager who has worked at the biggest social platforms of our time, Instagram, Facebook, and Snapchat. Her first product role began as an intern at Amazon in 2011, where she got her first taste of building and growing user products that scale to millions and billions of users globally. Valerie is a Latinx in Power because she's successful on paper, but more importantly, because she has worked to find her authentic voice in space where she was one of the few, the only, or didn't feel she belonged. In this episode, we'll talk about coming from a humble background and clawing your way to break into power and privilege, and using it to make space for others. Where does your life story begin?
For my parents, and my dad immigrated to the U.S. from Mexico along with 9 siblings. He came from a rural town, lived in a small house in East Los Angeles. He met my mom, and both of them lived the working class, paycheck to paycheck reality of being working poor. I remember as a kid, I had an awareness of survival and poverty ever since I was like 5 or 6. I remember the concept of rent and counting the dollars in my mom's wallet and seeing if we would have enough money and helping her write letters to family to ask for money. I used to eat sandwiches with purity mustard, no meat. I got free lunch at school and was a little bit bullied for it. I had a tough upbringing. We lived in a small apartment. It was on like a very busy highway. And I remember there was so many cars driving fast that people were run over in front of my house. And it was very traumatic. I couldn't really play outside as a kid. In sum, I grew up from a upbringing that was about being hungry, ashamed, stressed, and I hated those feelings. But that was also the greatest gift of a tough upbringing because it gave me an intense drive to get away, to earn. I think the inflection point was when I started to, at the age of 10, like sell goods for money at the swap meet. I used to take my mom's old makeup samples and sell them. And the first time that I earned $100 when I was 10, I thought I was really powerful. So that was like the catapult for me to be able to say I have earning power and I could do that for my family and maybe for my community. That led to the leaps of getting into education and technology so that I could break away from that upbringing.
Really inspiring story and interesting that you always had this mindset. And where did you find your voice?
My parents didn't teach me to speak up. And in fact, I think they lived in fear. I remember being 5 years old and learning that my dad wasn't fully a U.S. citizen. He, wasn't in a position to defend his rights in this country and still really isn't to date, even though he is a U.S. citizen. My mom, she passed away, but she worked long hours, worked overtime, worked weekends, and didn't get paid for that overtime, which is illegal. But they were both afraid to demand their rights with their workers or with society, really. And I was the opposite. I think just because I wanted to be different than them. I think all of us want to be different than our parents in some ways. And I remember finding my voice in religious education. I remember the teachings of some of the things that the nuns would tell me, and it just didn't feel right. Like, why can't, gay people get married? Why can't a woman become a priest even though the nuns are doing all the work? I asked all these questions, and to some degree, it wasn't totally respected, but the more that they pushed back, the louder that I got. I think I learned how to speak up for myself, especially in high school. I got motivated to run for school president, and I was president for 3 years, and that's like the first breeding ground where I learned how to like have a vision, bring people along, and like try to disrupt the status quo so that other people who are oppressed wouldn't be silent.
It's interesting how this is so common, especially coming from immigrants. A lot of times we are afraid to speak because we feel that it's not our place, or maybe because our life here is so much better or privileged or different. So we are afraid to complain or speak our mind. But I'm glad you find your voice since a really young age.
Thank you. I think it's a service to society. It's not that we're just trying to make it better for ourselves. But I think if we have a bunch of people that are silent, we're missing out on other people's ideas, other people's richness. And so it's a shame for everyone if not everyone has their voice heard. So thank you.
What does it mean to be a Latina for you?
Being a Latina it's an important piece of my identity, but it's not everything. I mean, I think in college, I started to first have a real identity. I grew up in a largely Mexican-American community. Most of the kids in my high school were first-generation American like me, speaking mostly English in school. Our parents were immigrants. We didn't know our identity until I went to college. And when I went to Stanford, where it was predominantly white and it was also very international, that's when I had a strong sense of, these people are different than me. Who am I? And it was only until I then found people that were from a similar first-generation Latino background that I really got to latch on to my identity, because I needed to know where I fit. And I found community in El Centro Chicano at Stanford, which is like the Latino student group. It's called Mecha, but it's like this Chicano student activism group. That's where I found my first like real sense of being a Chicana at that time, is how I would identify myself. And that's a term for Mexican Americans who grew up in the Southwest. It's a bit of a regional term. And of course, that Latina identity has evolved, and I respect all of the contributions of Latinos in society now. Of course, the Shakiras and the J-Los and all the passionate, loud women out there. But I also have an identity as a mom, as a wife, as a progressive, as a yogi, as a cat lover. There's so many different labels. But I think in tech, just to pause on that, like for me, being a Latina means outspoken, passionate, hardworking, but oftentimes underestimated. And I think Arlen Hamilton, the founder of Backstage Capital, has written a book about, how underestimated women of color are. As it relates to VC funding, 0.2% goes to Black women, but only 0.4% goes to Latinx women. I once pitched a startup for VC funding, and I got some traction, but they really wanted to pay me a ramen salary, and I couldn't afford that because I wanted to have a family. I wasn't going to go this far to live in poverty again and be in financial scarcity. So there's a lot of barriers to getting Latin-backed founders. But also being Latina means not well represented in tech. We hold less than 1 or 2% of technical and leadership roles in our industry. That's a problem. And then, the last piece is about being underpaid and poorly compensated. And while the average woman in the US makes 80 cents on the dollar of a man, that number drops to 61 cents for Black women and 53 cents for every dollar for a Latina. So a Latina she has to work twice as many hours in order to earn what her white male counterpart does. And I think that is unfortunately the Latina story of today, and it can't be the Latina story going forward.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, and thanks for sharing those numbers. I think it's so important to talk more about that. You found a way into many hot companies in Silicon Valley already. You worked at Amazon, Snapchat, Facebook, and Instagram. How did you find your way there and into the role of product management? Was that always your dream job?
No, this was not my dream job. I had no idea what this was. I had no exposure. You only know what you see. And I didn't know anybody in tech. I was at Stanford in 2007 when the biggest companies were coming to bear, but I had no friends in computer science. How would I have known that technology existed? It wasn't until really a decade later. In college, my dream was actually to get into politics. As you can tell, I wanted to be an advocate. I wrote my college senior thesis on political science and corporate diversity. I advocated on campus. And so I spent internships in Washington, D.C., working for a U.S. senator, working for nonprofits. But I saw that those people that were working in politics or activism were either broke themselves or living off of their parents. And I couldn't do either, because at that time I was still sending money back to my mom to help her pay rent. Like every week or month she would call me and it was so sad. She was like negotiating like how much money I could give her, lend her. And it was a tough situation. So I had to earn money from day one. So I started focusing on how can I increase my earning potential back to, that 10-year-old girl selling makeup. And I didn't know anyone in business, but I got involved in the undergrad business club. I was intimidated. I was the only Latina, but I forced myself to attend these like corporate recruiting events that were big on campus. I was lucky. I was at Stanford. Everyone wanted to recruit at that time, which is not necessarily the thing right now. But I went to these events, and actually some of my Latina friends mocked me. And it was tough because they were like, oh, you're going to be a sellout. Like, why are you not helping the community? And I was like, you need to oxygen mask, like take care of yourself first. And I need to provide for myself, my family. So I'm sorry, I'm unapologetic about this. I'm going into business. So I ended up joining the most exclusive consulting firm in McKinsey, partially because I was rejected by the others, but it was good training to get into McKinsey. But I transformed myself to work as, a rough around the edges 21-year-old fresh out of college into this polished corporate environment where you're working with executives. And I really enjoyed that. It was great exposure. I had to learn how to like understand business models and finance and strategy and marketing and organization design, all these things. It was like a boot camp in business. But finally, I found product manager as the ideal role in this century. And I think it's because like has a focus on what is a user problem, what is a customer problem, and then working with everyone who has the skills to build a solution for that, between engineers, data scientists, designers, to make it come to life. And I think actually like there's a lot of like being a Latina that really suited me well to being a product manager. One is an empathy and passion for users. Like Latinx are very community oriented. They're thinking about what is the pain, what is the experience, how does the system fail us, and how do we make it better? So that like problem solving and like system thinking of like how do we move the chess pieces in order to like advance our objectives subject to constraints. That's product management, and that is what Latinos do best. And then the drive and hustle. I mean, look, nobody gets it done like immigrants. We have the adversity, resilience muscle to turn a no into a yes and make something happen despite the odds and shoot for moonshots. So that's how I came into product. And I specifically focus on a type of product called growth, which is how do you get us to acquire new users? How do you get them to download your app? How do you get them to activate, to unlock the best benefits of the product? And then how do you get them to retain so that they keep finding value over and over again? And it's easy to launch an app, have people download it, but it's really hard to get it to stick. And that requires finding what the industry calls product market fit, which is like, how do you find the right pain point and the right solution that continues to add value over time such that you just have incredible tailwinds to growth? And so few products hit that mark. And I've been lucky to be able to work and learn from platforms that have that product market fit and help them scale to the next level, whether it is expanding to new international markets, expanding to new demographics, or helping users learn and kind of engage with new features that will help them kind of continue to find value on the product. So that's my profession now, and that's my journey.
I think this is a topic I'm seeing all episodes. Everyone is talking about how our past experience add to the experience we are having right now, even though sometimes you might feel that they don't have anything in common. And in your case, I can see how political science, being a Latina, and being a product manager, they all relate and add to each other.
Thank you for seeing that. That's exactly the message that I want to share. And I think that being an underrepresented Latina gives me the superpower of empathy to connect with users who feel isolated, who feel left out, who feel like they don't get it, or that the product doesn't get them. And I love to try to help everyone feel like the product was built for them. That's my desire. And that's actually what all businesses want, personalization. And so like I have that ability to see around the corner to anticipate where the user is, and then work with my team to try to get as close as possible to that expectation and exceed it. I also think that, being with, we know that culture innovates from the edges of society. Culture innovates from the youth. Culture immigrants from immigrants. Culture innovates from people that are outside of the core box. And so I love seeing are products used by real world people on the street. Like I remember when I was working at Snapchat and I was working on new lenses, or some people call them as face filters. The rainbow puke lens was very popular then.
Yeah.
And I would see the kids on the street using it. I was so excited. And then I would like go to the bar back then and I would literally go up to strangers at the bar while I was waiting for my drink. And I would say, have you tried the new Snapchat lens? Hey, here, try it. And I would like make them download it and like try to see the delight on their face. So I was just so passionate about that. But, at the same time, it is lonely being a Latina in tech. Like, a lot of times it's working with, largely male dominated engineering teams. It's pitching your ideas to largely white male dominated executives to fund your idea or support your idea. And sometimes it feels like a battle just to defend myself and my ideas and just do my job. But it's also exhilarating to be the one of the few representing and to know that like if I'm not there, who's going to be there to ask the tough questions? So that's like what I feel is my calling.
Yeah. What's your favorite thing about those experiences you had in tech?
I think it is calling out the user who's left out, the user that others haven't thought about, because it's almost like everyone's focused on the power user of today, but I'm thinking about the power user of tomorrow. And I feel like I have a special capability to be able to empathetically connect with them and figure out what is keeping them from being included in our service. And so I think what I hope to do over the next kind of years is really integrate like inclusive thinking into product development. And we're not totally there yet, but that's like a practice that I want to build and muscle.
I read your article about inclusion and diversity that you posted on LinkedIn. You wrote that even companies who are horrendous on diverse representation can still have inclusive managers and colleagues. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, so I think first let's break this area down because there's so much talk and hype around diversity and inclusion. I just want to explain it in really concrete, no BS terms. So, for me, diversity is, you think of the pie chart, like who's represented in the company, how many of your engineers are diverse, how many of your team is diverse, how many of your leadership is diverse. The second part is inclusion. So of those people that are on that pie chart, do they feel like they belong? Are they supported? Do they retain? Do they stick around? We talk about the retention curve in product management of people that churn out. What is the churn out rate for diverse employees in this industry? Or do they walk away? And finally is equity. Everyone talks about equity. What does that mean? For me, that means getting paid your fair share. And that's about, are you leveled fairly? Are you rewarded competitively? Are you evaluated fairly without bias? Those are the three components of diversity, inclusion, and equity that I would like to start as a ground context for our conversation.
You talked about inclusivity and diversity being a job of everyone in the company, not just the managers and diversity committees. Can you share with us your thoughts about what people can do to help to create a more inclusive environment?
I wrote about this concept on Medium of that I coined inclusive mindset. And it's a play on growth mindset, which is research by Carol Dweck out of Stanford and is very hyped up right now. Like everyone has a growth mindset. Like your capabilities are not innate. You have to reinvent yourself. You have to flex and build new muscles through perseverance and making it a practice. And I think inclusion is the same way. Like inclusion isn't innate. Nobody is necessarily born to be able to kind of understand others and like get over their similar to me biases. And so how this played out in my life, because I didn't really have a manager or a senior leader in my organization who shared my Latina identity. But there's a couple people that really helped me like kind of up level despite that. I remember in my first job, there was a senior partner at McKinsey and he was like very traditional, older white guy, looked the part, like his picture on the website, like who you would expect as a executive. And in my first performance review, he said, Val, you're really different than everyone else here, but you could be a partner at this firm and you would be incredible because your customers would love you and you would be great at developing business. And that boosted my confidence. I'm a short person and I stood like a foot taller that day. So that was like an inclusive mindset he had. Also, my undergrad professor, where in one of my first college classes, like I was super intimidated because I was a first gen kid. I went to a not so great high school and I was with all these other kids. I went to fancy prep schools. I felt like my essays weren't as good. And so he saw that and he created time to do weekly office hours with me to give me extra feedback and validate me. I needed that. He gave his time, and that was having an inclusive mindset. Finally, another example like of how you can be inclusive within, even despite what the company culture is. Like I was in a different company where the company culture was rough as a woman, rough as a Latina, rough as anything other. There was one colleague, a white guy actually. He, saw that in meetings I was sometimes undermined or overlooked, but he took time to listen with me, to hear me vent, and he eventually defended my work when my manager didn't. All of those were white male allies. They were very powerful micro actions. For me, it's about allies showing up and taking micro actions, versus kind of downplaying the microaggressions. That's kind of the spirit that I want to evangelize for people to understand.
And I think it's also important to keep in mind there's also some nuances. So you might feel included in some groups and some teams and might feel excluded in others. So I think it's important to keep an eye on that and also speak up and help each other and have empathy, and don't think that, oh, this problem is solved, because it might not. Maybe you don't know, or maybe in another group, another team, another product, this person it's excluded and you have no idea because maybe you're not paying attention.
That's a great point. And I think a lot of the traps, like the other side of it, they're not always like malintentioned at all. I think they're just like weak inclusion capabilities. And so like one example of this is like people who are really insecure or awkward to talk about diversity and inclusion. Like I had one teammate who was really thoughtful and powerful and influential in so many other projects. And when I brought some of these ideas and proposals up, they froze. They were so afraid, like petrified. And that's not helpful for them or for the organization. Also, to kind of claim that we are in like a colorblind society, that everyone's the same and there's no issues, that's kind of a state of denial. That's not helpful. And of course, we don't need to talk about all of the kind of microaggressions of all of the kind of difficult things that come up that we don't really have a safe space to talk about that. That's, I think, what your podcast can help us all kind of be aware of.
Yeah, for sure. I remember one of the first jobs I had here, I worked with someone and the person knew I'm Brazilian, and she was like, oh, you have an European style. And I was like, what does it mean? And I was like, what is happening?
Lack of context. Yeah, and lack of exposure. And that's why, but like the fact that we're so underrepresented exacerbates that lack of exposure because we're the only exposure they have. So we have a lot of work to do.
Is there one quote you love to live by?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot lately. The mantra that I'm coming up with is like, don't ask us, so where are you from, really? Instead, ask us, where are you going? Look, like I carry a good amount of privilege. Like I'm educated, I'm a light-skinned Latina, like mixed race. But, as soon as someone sees my last name or they hear me talk differently with my accent, at least a quarter or half of the time, in Silicon Valley and pretty much anywhere I go, I get asked, so where are you from, really? And I'm like, I'm from LA, and that's where I grew up. They're like, no, you can't be. But really, where are you from? And I'm like, I'm American. I have papers I can show you. Like, this question triggers my insecurity so deeply. It's back to that 5-year-old girl that was worried about my dad's citizenship status. And, there's an implicit assertion that also where my family is from is the most defining kind of element of my identity. And it's important. It's my story. But like, that's a lot of baggage. That's like bringing people back, holding them back. And so I think ideal is to instead ask, where are you from? Or like kind of, assume that you're different, is to ask, where are you going? And I think that is a little bit of a uniting question. It's a forward-looking question. It's an opportunity question. It's about, what is your vision? Where are you from? And like, what could we do together? That's a much more like open-ended, lightning question versus one that's unintentionally triggering.
Yeah, you can have a lot of interesting conversations starting with that. I always joke that sometimes really I say hi And the person, where are you from? Was like, I just said hi.
Yeah, it's extra baggage for sure. It definitely it just kills the energy. So it's just not fun for anyone.
Yeah, for sure. Someone in your LinkedIn mentioned that you get things done. And I think this is an amazing quality to have. What recommendation would you give to someone to craft this mindset or even get more things done?
Yeah, I think this is super important. I think because there's so few of us and because we really have to prove ourselves, I think there's an implicit expectation that we need to be better than our mainstream counterparts because the perceptions are stacked against us. The perception, that I've heard from, colleagues or back in college, you've only got here because you're Latina or, affirmative action. And, that gives me an extra drive to constantly prove that I'm adding value. And I think that getting stuff done is, about making sure that my performance review or that my track record of outcomes is undeniable so that if there's any bias in the system that I can defend myself. And I remember preparing for performance reviews when I was young in my career, summaries of impact, growth, accomplishment, milestone, metrics, wins, all of those things. I think without those, I would feel like I don't have any armor to defend myself. I think it's really important, for any, Latinx who wants to gain influence or be respected, is to constantly keep a scoreboard of what have you achieved lately? What am I achieving this week, this month, this half? I don't define my personal worth by these professional accomplishments, but I think it does define my commercial worth. It does define my financial earning. And as a provider in my family, that matters. So we don't have the capacity in Slack to just hope that we will be liked and rewarded for that.
And I think it's also important to keep in mind that you can have a space, a moment, a certain period of time that you can relax, not just think about getting things done.
Oh, 100%. I mean, there's so many times that I think part of my experience of, grinding from a young age, working for money since I was 10, there's been moments of burnout. And so, you're not going to be good to the world if you're not good to yourself. And there's been a lot of philosophers and kind of spirituality teachers and research that shows you need moments of stillness, of silence, of inaction, of boredom, of rest, of vacation, of downtime, of unplugging in order to have creative, efficient mental health and productivity. So I don't want to be one of those people that does the hustle, romanticizing hustle at all costs.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I understand what you're saying. And what has been your proudest moment personally or professionally?
Yeah, well, I think that's, a good segue on what we were just talking about and kind of what matters in life. I think the pride comes not with what I've achieved, but what I overcame. I remember surviving a precancerous health scare when I was a teenager, and I was dealt a tough blow of infertility, which is something that we don't talk about in our community much. There's a lot with that, but through great sacrifice and perseverance, I was eventually able to become a mom. And, becoming a mom is my most proudest. My proudest milestone. And our son is now 2 years old. He's a strong boy. We named him Benito Cuauhtemoc for the first president of Mexico who was a poor indigenous outsider, and the great Aztec emperor. He's our pride and joy. That's what matters in life. I survived a lot of mental health challenges, the anxiety, depression, the kind of PTSD of growing up a hard immigrant life, but yet it's even taboo in our culture to talk about some of these things. It's just pray about it. Don't talk about it. Don't get professional help. Don't get medication. Don't do yoga. There's a lot of, I think, unhealthy taboos around mental health in our community. And so I've learned various meditation, spiritual, holistic healing practices in order to feel whole again. And I'm really proud of not being afraid to talk about that. And hopefully that helps one more person be okay to open up and ask for help.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing your story. And what tips would you like to share with other Latinx around the globe, especially the first generation immigrants?
I think a couple of things. We don't know what we don't see, and no one has given us an apprentice guidebook. We have not, a lot of us, unfortunately, some of us have, but a lot of us haven't grown up around business people, around technologists, around professionals. And so these are some of the tips that I've learned in my experience, and I hope to pass it along. And I think first is, whatever you're trying to do in your profession or your educational career is like kind of understand the decision makers, the rules of the game. And I call it almost like the chess pieces. Like if you want to get a job or you want to move ahead or you want to get accepted to a program, understand who's deciding, who can be the allies and sponsors that can help move the chess pieces for you, because you may only be a pawn. And I've felt like a pawn many times. You need like a knight or a bishop to help advocate for you. Secondly is, I think, the give and take of gaining political capital. And this applies like, in the workplace or anywhere really, relationships, but like you kind of want to have a right balance of like putting points on the board and adding value, and then the give and take of using that capital for things that you want to get achieved. So like when I join a new job, I'm kind of really keen to like make some quick wins, show that I can like advance the business objectives. And then when the moment comes for me to like speak up and advocate for like inclusion or kind of things that I feel are personally important, I have some leverage. And then if I go too far on that spectrum, I have to go back, double down on the business goals and get more influence so that I can then, it's like, kind of chips in a casino. And then the last piece is also talking about money and focusing on money. We, there's a lot of like taboo about talking about money, whether you're a woman, whether you're, a person of color, life is about love and family, which it is, but money is also important too. And so talking about, compensation and what are your goals, like I'm talking about that with your manager and your teams, trying to figure out like, am I paid fairly? And there's a lot of like websites, like one called Levels FYI, which like gives like pay grade compensation bands so that you can have some data points to talk about money. And knowing where you're going, like, if you don't have a safety net, you got to think about, well, when do I want to retire? How much money do I need when I retire? How do I work backwards from that? That's like the financial education that is going to prevent us from not having to work into our late 70s. So those are things that no one has taught me, but I'm now just at 35 starting to focus on.
You often talk about advocating within tech, and also about surviving the trauma of the immigrant experience, racism and poverty in the US. How do you see the contrast of raising a child in the privileged Silicon Valley?
Oh, it's such a big thing. I think about it all the time. We're in Palo Alto right now, like renting a house that has a yard. And, before the pandemic, I had some foresight and luck to, get him a swing set, a trampoline, a little mini basketball hoop, a soccer set, like, a big library of books, all of these things. And none of the things that I had as a kid. I remember having like one ball and just throwing it against the wall. And that's how I spent my youth. And we're raising a child that's going to have immense more privilege than we did. He's young, he's just 2 years old. But as he gets older, I think having, a wise spiritual teacher, once told me, like, don't pray for an easy life, pray for strength and resilience for your child. And I think that's right. Like, I don't want to be necessarily like a tiger mother that says, oh, okay, you need to go to Stanford like I did. You need to have GPA like this. You need to study coding and math as a 4-year-old. Like, I kind of see myself as like what I'm calling like a lion mother. And for me, that is like the ability to hunt. That is ability to have a pride. That is the ability to, be aggressive and like wrestle with others in order to survive. Because, as we know now in 2020, that generation, my kids' generation, is going to have immense challenges that nobody knows how to solve. Climate change, economic disruption, migration patterns, social strife, public debt. There's so much. So I want a kid who's a survivor. I don't want a kid who's just an achiever.
Interesting. So you're teaching your child to be problem solver rather than an achiever, and having problem solver skills, he can do whatever he wants, and this is amazing. I want to finalize this episode with first thanking you, Valerie. That was amazing. And I also want to finalize with kindness. How important it is to be a positive influence within your stakeholders and your team.
It's so important. And, I'll admit, like, sometimes I've failed on this to some degree before I talk about, what works. And it's not that I'm a mean person at all or like, but I think, especially with the pandemic, working from home, sometimes we don't have a lot of patience and we want to be like very efficient and like transactional and like, this is the project to get done. Like, are you working on it? And like kind of not being very relationship oriented, just being efficient, especially with like work chat in the beginning of the pandemic. I was over reliant on being task oriented and I was underinvested in the relationships. And I think now we need to be the opposite because there's so much going on between like the fires that we're having, not having air quality, not being able to like, take care of ourselves and see our family and friends. It's a very hard time. So for me, kind of what kindness means is taking an interest in what is most important to that person and being present for that, even if you can't necessarily do anything about it. But like I think, tried to have more conversations that are relational to say like, what's important to you right now? Is it getting promoted? Is it being less lonely? Is it finding meaning? Is it being closer to your family? Is it getting a puppy? Is it finding peace? Like, and I think kindness is a curiosity in the other person for who they are, and just being there for them. And I think 2020 has taught us that life is short, so we should all be asking what matters and telling each other what that is so that we can work towards it like there's no tomorrow.
It's a great point.
Yeah, I think I'll just close by like kind of acknowledging that and the time that we're in, like we've learned a lot from the Black Lives Matter movement this year, and a lot around confronting the own like kind of anti-Black racism in our own community, listening to our Afro-Latino voices, knowing, the unique challenge of, the bias and the harm against, our Black friends and community members. So being there for them. And I think we're also kind of stepping into the Latino Hispanic Heritage Month, which is a lot of time when people, companies will try to like, throw salsa parties and taco mixers. But like more important than that is talking about the real issues of like where we are as a community, how we're doing right now with COVID, with economic harm, with kind of equity. And then also the vast potential that the Latino and Latinx community brings in the future for a growing population, a young population, and huge economic power. So I think that's something to celebrate and to raise awareness for. That's why we're here.
Awesome. Amazing. Thank you so much. That was incredible.
Thank you. I had so much fun and I love the community, and I'm happy to help other people who are just along their way.
We had amazing learnings today. We talked about once you gain power, it's important to find and using your voice to represent and advocate for inclusion. All of this while trying to stay human, healthy, and whole as a mom in these pandemic times. That's it for today. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. We'll have more interviews with amazing Latinx every first Tuesday of the month. Check our website, latinxempower.com, to hear more. Don't forget to share comments and feedback, always with kindness. See you soon.